20 minutes of reading a day paves the way to success. Ask questions about the story and let your child predict what happens next. Engaging their imagination makes reading more enjoyable. For more information, readjax.org.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjax.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler, and on today's First Coast Connect, with his 4-year term as Chief Judge coming to a close, we ask U.S. District Judge Tim Corrigan about his years on the bench, surviving an assassination attempt, and playing a bit part in the Netflix movie, The Legend of Cocaine Island. Then, between boat collisions and plastic pollution, the threats to right whales continue to grow. We talk to species champions ahead of the annual Right Whale Festival on Amelia Island. And our resident spaceman, Eddie Whistler, tells us about the ghostly dust haunting outer space, including the aptly titled Witch Head Nebula. We'll talk about all that and take your calls and questions at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at WJCT.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. Vice President Kamala Harris delivered what her campaign calls the closing argument of her presidential campaign in Washington, D.C. last night. Harris spoke from the Ellipse near the White House. NPR's Tom Dreisbach reports that's where Donald Trump rallied his supporters ahead of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol.
Harris suggested Trump was a petty tyrant and wannabe dictator, and said voters already know who he is.
He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election.
At a town hall earlier this month, Trump called January 6th a, quote, day of love. Throughout his campaign, he has promised to issue pardons to January 6 rioters. He calls them patriots and political prisoners. Tom Dreisbach, NPR News.
There continues to be controversy over a joke told by a comedian at a Trump rally on Sunday. It disparaged Puerto Rico. The chairman of the Republican Party of Puerto Rico called the comedian's comment racist and demanded that Trump apologize. Trump has said he does not know the comedian. Trump held a rally last night in Allentown, Pennsylvania. The majority of the city's population is Latino. Many Trump supporters, like Vivian Colon, a Puerto Rican American, were on hand to cheer on Trump.
He's a human who has made some mistakes and said some things he probably shouldn't have. Doesn't erase the fact of everything that he's done for our country, has set it in the right direction, and I know he'll do it again.
Trump will campaign today in North Carolina and Wisconsin. Harris will campaign in North Carolina, too. Then she goes on to stump in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says cases of a type of walking pneumonia are surging across the U.S. NPR's Maria Godoy reports young children are affected.
Mycoplasma pneumonia is a type of mild pneumonia caused by a bacterial infection. The CDC says cases began rising in the spring and summer, and that spike has continued into fall. The infection spreads through coughs and sneezes and is most common among kids ages 5 to 17, as well as young adults. While this age group is still getting sick, Dr. Adam Ratner with NYU and Hassenfeld Children's Hospital in New York City says this year, younger kids are also being affected.
We're seeing more cases in sort of that 2 to 4 year old age range. That's being seen nationwide, and it's consistent with what we're seeing here.
Ratner says many cases can be treated at home, but if a child has a fever that lasts several days or is having trouble breathing, call the doctor. Maria Godoy, NPR News.
You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
And this is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. As preparations begin for next month's Jacksonville Fair, officials say it will stay downtown for another year before moving to its new home on Normandy Boulevard in 2026. Construction's already started on the 80 acres of land next to the Jacksonville Equestrian Center and the Cecil Aquatic Center on the west side. Plans call for a state-of-the-art event, an educational venue with exhibition facilities and an amphitheater. This year's fair runs from November 7th through the 17th at the current fairgrounds in downtown Jacksonville. For ticket information, visit jacksonvillefair.com. In a long-anticipated move, two internet industry groups are filing a challenge to a new Florida law aimed at keeping children off social media sites. The measure in part prevents children under 14 from opening a social media account. Parental consent is required for 14 and 15-year-olds. The Computer and Communications Industry Association and NetChoice, whose members include tech giants like Google and Meta, say in a federal lawsuit that the law violates First Amendment rights and that parents should be the ones to make decisions about their child's social media use. The groups want to prevent the law known as HB3 from moving forward. State officials have previously said they will fight back against the challenge. This afternoon in Jacksonville, we're going to have sunny skies with highs in the lower 80s. Just a slight chance for rain out at the beaches. Partly cloudy overnight with lows in the lower 70s. Mostly sunny in the afternoon tomorrow, highs in the lower 80s.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Sony Pictures, presenting the new movie Here, reuniting the director, writer, and stars of Forrest Gump, a tale of love, loss, laughter, and life. Here is only in theaters this Thursday.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, he's spent 4 years as chief judge and 28 on the bench. Today, we ask U.S. District Judge Tim Corrigan about what it takes to serve and why that job may be getting harder. Later in the program, celebrating right whales while trying to save the species from extinction. But first, he's presided over high-profile cases, narrowly survived an assassination attempt, and made a career of making difficult decisions. To discuss the rewards and very real risks of the job, we're joined by Chief U.S. District Judge Timothy Corrigan. Good morning.
Good morning, Ann.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So I wanted to start by just talking about the atmosphere in your courtroom. I've had the opportunity to cover a number of cases that you've presided over, and you have cultivated a climate in that courtroom that I think is really interesting. You take the time to shake jurors' hands. You make a point of speaking directly to families, victims, in a very thoughtful way. And I wanted to just ask you, is that something that you've given a lot of thought to in terms of creating a courtroom climate and what it is that you're going for?
Well, I think it is intentional, and I think what I think we try to do is to take what is a very stressful, difficult situation for really everybody in the courtroom and to try to bring a level of civility to it. And if you treat people with respect, if you keep your voice modulated, if you keep everyone feeling that they're being heard, then everything goes better and everybody is on their best behavior, and it just creates an atmosphere that is more conducive to good decision making, and hopefully people will, even if they don't agree with a decision, hopefully they will at least feel they were heard and in a process that was fair and respectful to them.
You are very deferential to your jurors, and I know sometimes you have them even kind of stand up during court breaks. You want to make sure everybody's getting a little bit of movement in their day with these long hours of sitting. And being a judge is a lot of sitting too, I imagine. But what feedback do you hear from the jurors, when they've sat on a case? A lot of people are, resistant to even respond to jury duty.
Yeah. What happens is people show up for jury duty often very grudgingly, and they don't want to be there. They wish they were somewhere else. They wish they didn't have to do it. But what we find is The people that are actually picked, and then they go through the process, and then they realize how important it is. They realize what their role is, and by the end of it, almost universally, we give them a survey at the end of their service, and almost universally, they are positive about their experience. It's kind of a transformation once they actually are involved and they see what it is, and they see how important their role is under our Constitution. We could have, under our laws, we could have a judge decide cases, or we could have the government decide cases, but the Constitution says it has to be decided by a jury of the person's peers. And I think jurors really warm up to that and really almost enjoy the experience by the time it's over and think it's very valuable.
We should note there has been an issue of concern for you recently when it comes to jury duty, generally speaking, because there has been sort of a concerted scam effort. Tell us what you're seeing, what you're hearing about that.
Well, thank you for asking. This was really kind of the primary reason I wanted to come talk with you this morning. So what's happening is we are in the middle of a very bad jury scam. What's happening is people are getting phone calls that are saying, for example, Chief Judge Corrigan, me, has issued a warrant for your arrest, and unless you pay us a certain amount of money, you're going to be arrested. And they're saying you're being arrested because you failed to report for jury duty. And it's a complete scam. The court would never call somebody and demand money. The marshal would never do that. The sheriff would never do that. And so it's a very big scam, but it's very realistic. And people believe it's either that I've issued a warrant for their arrest or that they're in trouble. And they'll go and pay money to these scammers. And so the message is the court, nobody from the court, nobody from law enforcement will ever call you and tell you you've missed jury duty and ask for money. That just is not the way the system works. If you miss jury duty or you're supposed to be there and some reason you're not, you'll get notice. You'd have an opportunity to explain yourself. So do not pay money to these scammers. Sometimes they ask for gift cards. Sometimes they ask for Venmo. Just don't do it. And unfortunately, oftentimes they prey on the most vulnerable, elderly or other people who may not be as cognizant of how the system works. And unfortunately, I think some people fall prey to it. But we are trying to get the word out that it's a scam. Don't fall for it.
Some of their tactics are really quite sophisticated, though, in terms of how they spoof phone numbers, the information that they may have about someone.
One of the problems that we're having is that these calls are so realistic that even professionals, lawyers, and others who should know better still are concerned that maybe it is real because it just sounds so real. They know names and they know information about you and they know information about the court system. And it just makes it sound so real that people fall prey to it.
It does seem like one universal when it comes to scam attempts is that there's always this note of urgency. And I guess it's good for everybody to sort of use that as a red flag if you feel like you have to make a decision right there and then.
That's exactly right. Nobody's ever, no legitimate person is ever going to say you have to do this morning, or if you don't do it by noon that you're going to get arrested. That's just not a legitimate statement, and so that should be a red flag that this is a scam.
Yeah, well, if you're just joining us, we are talking to Chief Judge Timothy Corrigan. He is on the verge of a senior status, and he is stepping down as the Chief Judge of the Middle District of Florida. If you would like to call or comment, you can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or reach out on social media. I have had the opportunity to attend some seminars that you've presented at the courthouse with media, trying to kind of present what the court does, educate the media, advise them about how best to approach, covering federal court. And you've said at that time that you thought that there were some stories that, you were always surprised. There were certain cases that got a lot of attention and other cases that got none at all. Are there any cases that you wish had gotten more attention? Either a type of case or a particular case that you think deserved the attention of people?
It's always when you ask a question like that, it's always hard to have something come to mind right at the moment. But what the what I was conveying was that there's a lot of interesting business matters that go on in this community. There's a lot of interesting cases involving individuals who people probably know about, and they're all public record. And it's just a question of sometimes you don't really know about them because back in the old days, very old days, and I go back a while. There used to be actually journalists assigned just to the court system to cover the courts. And what we find now is that that's unfortunately with the realities of media these days, that's just not available. And so what we try to do is to provide opportunities to educate young journalists and local journalists about how the system works and where they can find information so that they can report on cases that would be of public interest. And so that's really the point we were trying to make.
Yeah. There was one case that I remember in particular, and I was really, I think, just moved by the sentencing thoughts that you had. It was the case involving the Guantanamo Bay commander, Captain John Nettleton, and his family had always felt that the family of the person who died in that case had always felt that that was a deliberate act, that the captain was responsible, but he was not charged with murder, and you were sentencing him for something else entirely, an obstruction charge. But you took a long time to address to them kind of the trauma and the agony that they were feeling, and the fact that they weren't probably going to be happy with the sentence. And I'm just curious what kind of preparation goes into those comments that you make during a sentencing.
Well, first of all, as I've said oftentimes, sentencing is by far the hardest thing that judges do by a long shot. But it is, I think it's really important that when you are sentencing, that you realize you're not just sentencing an individual, but that there are a lot of other stakeholders in the process. And one of those stakeholders, in the case you're referencing, was were the family of the person who died. And what I was trying to convey in that case was that he was not charged with, Captain Nettleton was not charged with the murder. He was charged with obstruction of justice. And so there wasn't going to be a sentence in that case that would be commensurate with a murder sentence. And that and I was trying to explain that to the family. So at least they might not agree with it. They might wish he had been charged with something else. But my hope was at least that it would be something that I could explain, and I would try to have them understand it as best they possibly could. And if you do that, again, you don't always win over the room that way. But I do think it's important to at least try to explain to people what's happening. Another example of that is very often when I'm sentencing somebody for some very serious crimes, their family is there, and their family doesn't see the person the way that I see them. And so I try to explain to them how serious what they were charged with was, what their record is, because very often the family doesn't realize all that. They just see the person they know and they love. And so those are efforts I make. I don't know if it's always successful, but I do think it's an attempt to just make sure that anybody who has a stake in that sentence at least feels like that their issues have been addressed.
Do you do that somewhat for your own self?
I do. One of the things that you're doing when you're pronouncing a sentence, or at least that I'm doing, is I'm working through it as I'm pronouncing it. What are the issues? Why am I doing what I'm doing? Who's involved? Who might be a victim? What's the defendant's family situation? What's the defendant's situation? Is this a person that's likely to recidivate, where the public needs protection from him? Or is this a person who is remorseful, probably rehabilitated, and that might play into it? So as you're going through that process, I'm talking as much to myself as I am to anybody else.
I'd like to take a call from Bill in Arlington. Good morning, Bill. Go ahead.
Yes, a quick question about credit cards. I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse or not, but I was had an issue with a credit card. It had been hacked, and the credit card company or the bank that supported that sent it to the credit bureau, and that was kind of devastating for me because I'm a small business person and I use credit quite a bit. Would that be legal or illegal? They discovered the hack. They fixed it all and sent me the information. But in the interim, I'm still dealing with the fact that it hurt my credit with the credit bureau.
Thanks, Bill.
So I wouldn't be able to comment on a specific case like Bill's, but certainly that is an issue that happens. I would recommend that Bill seek legal counsel if he needs to try to straighten things out. There are also credit repair agencies and others that might be able to be of assistance to him, but I wouldn't be able to comment on his specific case.
We've a call from Landon in Lakeshore. Good morning, Landon. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. So I just had a question with regard to kind of what feels like competitive or dualistic nature of our justice system. It seems like it's mostly, plaintiff versus defendant, and it oftentimes comes down to he who has or she who has the most resources wins, and not really the objective truth of the matter is what we're getting to within this sort of dualistic nature. I'm just wondering if there's ways we can reconcile that to where it's not just, who can pay for the most resources and, present the best argument. Are there ways that we can get more to the truth of the matter and figure out, who actually is guilty objectively versus just, who can provide the most convincing argument with this plaintiff versus defendant kind of system we have?
Good question, Landon.
So it is a good question, and there's no doubt that economic considerations do play into our civil justice system, which it sounds like what your caller is talking about. However, the system does provide, for example, in personal injury cases, if that's what we're talking about, the system does provide the ability to get a lawyer if you're injured who will work on a contingency basis. And then usually the defendant is represented by a lawyer who's paid by an insurance company or something along those lines. And my experience is that certainly there's no doubt that economics can play a role in how the system works. But if you have good lawyers on both sides, that can really go a long way toward making the system work. We also have, frankly, a lot of folks, though, that can't afford lawyers in certain situations, pro se parties we call them, and we do everything we can to try to keep the scales of justice balanced for them, but it is a difficult thing. And so the more we can keep that balance in play, the better off we are.
Pro se cases can be sort of agonizing to watch and preside over, I'm sure.
Well, they are, but they're all persons who have a complaint, and we have to treat it fairly. I mean, one of the things that is good about our system is that we do take every case and we look at it and we try to come to the right decision. And so, but it is difficult. I often say that being a pro se party is a little bit like trying to be your own doctor. It's just a difficult thing not to have the professional training that our system kind of works better at. But we do the best we can because people do have a constitutional right to represent themselves.
We have a question from Jane on Facebook. She says, please ask the judge how an older person can be placed in the jury pool. I know there is an age that we are removed, but I would like to serve on a grand jury or at least be called up for jury duty.
So the law is that if you're 70 years of age or older, you're not required to be on jury duty any longer, but you're not disqualified. And so, but it's all random. One thing that people may not appreciate is that we don't go out and hand pick who the people are that are going to serve on grand juries or on regular juries, on trial juries. It's all a random system. You get it's based on, in the federal system, it's based on voter registration. It's all randomized. So some people will say to me, I've been called 3 or 4 times in the last 2 years, and other people will say, I've been wanting to be called for 20 years and I've never been called, and that's simply because it's the random nature of it. And the reason it's random is that we want to bring in and create as fair a system as we can, so that we're not handpicking certain people to come in and hear cases.
We have a call from Ricky on the north side. Good morning, Ricky. Go ahead.
Yes, Judge, thank you for letting me have that call. I had an issue with an attorney. He cheated me and or charged me, and there was a bunch of issues. So I made a complaint against the attorney, and I'm wondering if you deal with issues like that, or I got a feeling that the attorneys are all together as a group, and they really don't look at the client's issue. So I was not able to do anything against the attorney for the abuse that I received. I'm just wondering if you do cases like that.
Thanks, Ricky.
So the way that works is, if you do, I don't actually handle grievances against attorneys unless those attorneys are actually appearing in front of me and have created an issue in front of me. But the Florida Bar does process complaints, and they get them quite often, unfortunately. Most attorneys, I think, try to do a good job, but if you have a situation where an attorney is you feel like they've violated their obligations to you or the ethical codes, then you can bring a complaint with the Florida Bar, and they will look into it and do the best they can to adjudicate it.
I want to ask you about some presiding over a high-profile case. So you were the judge in the corruption case of former U.S. Congresswoman Corrine Brown. You presided over the discrimination case that was brought by Black firefighters in Jacksonville. You were presiding over the corruption trial of former Jacksport Authority Chair Tony Nelson. And I'm curious if you feel any particular obligation or heat when you're presiding over a case that's getting just an enormous amount of public scrutiny.
So we try to handle it exactly the way we would handle any other case. But what we also try to do is to make sure that the public has a right to attend, and that the media has a right to attend. Now, the federal court is a little different than the state court. As you know, we don't allow cameras in the courtroom, which sometimes is a bone of contention with the media. But we do invite the media in. We enter orders that allows them to bring their equipment in. We really want to try to make it be as helpful as possible, so that people who are charged with covering these things can cover them. And then we have issues from time to time that come up. Unfortunately, we had one situation in a high-profile case where a member of the media tried to talk to the jury during the case, and we had to deal with that. So we have some situations, and I think that's just kind of, again, a lack of understanding of the system sometimes. But once you're trying the case, it's the same. I will say that in pronouncing sentence or pronouncing decisions, very often we know that there might be higher public interest, and so we might take a little more effort in trying to explain the situation and why we're doing what we're doing. And in certain cases, we'll actually hand out sentencing statements to the media so that it can be, exactly what we said. And so there is a little bit of difference, but once you're actually in the courtroom and you're trying the case, you do everything you can to make it just like any other case and handle it the same way.
You are very accessible in terms of, or you make your courtroom accessible to the media. You've been, I think, very good to the media in terms of accommodations. Would you like to see cameras in the courtroom if it was permissible?
It's a interesting and complicated question. The reason not to do it, and the reason that it hasn't been adopted in the federal courts, is the concern that it changes the way people act when they know they're on camera. And there's also sometimes issues of potential protection of witnesses and things like that that can also be an issue. So that's the reason not to do it. The reason to do it is that I do think sometimes how the court system works and the public's understanding of it would be benefited if they could actually see what happens. And so I think it's a real interesting question. I'm certainly open to considering it in the future. I mean, that's really a decision made at the national level by the Judicial Conference. But I'm not unalterably opposed to it. But I also think that there are good reasons why we don't do it, and it at least it keeps the sketch artists in business.
We've got a call from Elda at the Beaches. Good morning. I have a question for you about this sketch artist, but good morning, Elda. Go ahead.
Hi, Melissa, and hello, Mr. Corrigan. My husband is the officer that was shot and killed on October 12th, and I would love to know how I get you for his court case. I don't know where to start or anything, but I just, what you're saying is so beautiful about how you handle your court.
Elda, we're so sorry about your husband's death. Judge Corrigan.
Well, first of all, I am beyond sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what you're going through, and I'm deeply sorry and deeply grateful for your husband's service. I will say to you that one feature of our system, and this is not maybe what you're going to want to hear, but one feature of our system is that there are two different court systems. There's a state system. There's a federal system. I'm a federal judge, and so I don't know where your husband's case would go, but we also have a random assignment system. People don't get to pick which judges they want, and we don't get to pick which cases we want. It's done frankly, by a computer, and a case gets filed, and it's assigned to one of the judges on a random basis, and that's exactly why it's set up that way. So you can't pick your judge, and the judge can't pick your case, and that it's designed to have impartial justice. But I am just so sorry for your loss.
I want to ask you, Judge Corrigan, since we're kind of on the topic of, the very risky job of people in, law enforcement and judges and, people in the judicial system, because you had obviously very traumatic instance that people may be familiar with, where there was a attempt on your life. You were shot at in your own home. And I'm sure that has been an affecting incident for you. But it really does, I think, raise the question of judicial security, judicial safety, perhaps more of a concern now than it has been in the past. I'm just interested if what you can tell us about how you view the security of a federal judge.
So obviously what happened to me back in 2013 was a very difficult experience. I came within 1.6 inches of having a gunshot go through my head. And so it's been a very traumatic experience for both myself and my family. But of course, everybody in life suffers trauma. People lose loved ones, they get sick. So we're not unique in that regard. But fortunately, we were able to they were able to apprehend the person. We were protected, and it all turned out about as well as it could have. But in answer to your broader question, there is an increased threat level against judges. The number of threats against federal judges continues to increase. And the U.S. Marshal Service does a good job of trying to be proactive on dealing with those threats. But what I really and I have to compliment as a group my judicial colleagues. We don't let those threats interfere with what we're doing. People come to work every day and do their jobs, even though they are the subject of threats. And so I think that's a credit to the judiciary as a whole. But it is what we need to do, I think, is to kind of lower the temperature. Threats. There's a difference between criticism and threats. Every judge is entitled to be criticized for their decisions. One of the reasons we have judicial independence is to try to insulate us from having to try to play to politics or play to some constituency. But when it devolves into actual physical threats against a judge or their family or somebody tries to take action, that's when it goes beyond the pale and threatens the rule of law. And so we're doing everything we can to protect ourselves as best we can, but it would be good if the criticism of the judiciary could be focused on their decisions and not made as a physical threat against the judge or their family.
Certainly. We have an email from Jessica. She says that as a young attorney, I appeared before Judge Corrigan a couple of times. To this day, he remains the best example I've seen in my 30-plus year career of judicial civility. I would just like to say thank you.
Very nice.
Yeah. There were there was coverage of this shooting incident against you when it happened. And then you didn't talk about it until after the sentencing happened and the assailant was sent to prison. But there was at least one humorous element of the whole trauma, which you described in a discussion with another judge friend of yours about kind of rolling up on a restaurant when you were under this heavy supervised security. Tell us what happened there.
So after they thought they had caught the person, and so the threat level was, they thought, reduced. They were still trying to make sure there was nobody else involved, but I was in a armored vehicle, which I was for 45 days. I was under detail, and there was a chase car right behind it. So we were going to a restaurant. Usually we went in the back. This time we went into the front, and so this thing rolls up, and you realize, if you're sitting there outside in the restaurant, you think, well, this is somebody. There's an armored vehicle, there's a chase car, it looks like a little bit of security, so this must be somebody. And so people started taking their cameras out. I think they thought it was like Taylor Swift or somebody like that. That would be about what you would think. And so they thought it was going to be some celebrity or something getting out of this vehicle. And of course, I pop out, and you can see them saying, "Who the heck is this guy?" And they were all putting their cameras away and going back they were very disappointed.
Just very briefly, because I am taking up more time than I said I would, but you have a bit part in a film called The Legend of Cocaine Island, and it was because the sentence that you pronounced was so unique. Can you just tell us how you came to that sentence?
Sure. This was a 60-something-year-old construction president who was in a very unlikely situation, charged with attempted possession of cocaine by going over to an island. He had a buried treasure map. He was looking for cocaine, and it was a long story. I know you're short on time, but basically it was he had committed the crime, but it was pretty clear he wasn't really a criminal. And so when I sentenced him, I sentenced him to a very short jail term. But the primary thing I did was I took advantage of his construction experience and gave him 20 hours a week working for Habitat for Humanity. And he not only fulfilled that, but he kept doing it afterwards. And it just turned out to be kind of a good thing for everybody. And somebody got a hold of it. I think it was because of the treasure map and the cocaine and all that it made for an interesting story, and they made a docudrama out of it. And I had a bit part at the very end of it, and it's called The Legend of Cocaine Island, and it's still on Netflix. It's been on there now for like 6 years. It's really been kind of a remarkable experience. I would have never imagined I would be on Netflix, but there I was.
Nice that there's a sentence that kind of satisfies everybody in the end and does good. Judge Corrigan, thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Florida starts Friday, and the annual Right Whale Festival is this weekend, and it's a chance to celebrate. But there are some harsh realities facing the North Atlantic right whale. Joined now to talk about it by Barb Zoodsma. She's the former large whale recovery coordinator at NOAA. Good morning.
Good morning.
We're joined on the line by Greg Reilly, Southeast Marine campaigner for the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And Dr. M. Devenish, educator and member of the Amelia Island Whale Ambassadors. Good morning.
Good morning.
So explain to us, if you can, briefly, Dr. Devenish, what is the primary challenge that is facing this species on the verge of extinction?
So the North Atlantic right whale was hunted almost to extinction hundreds of years ago, and then the population grew back. But since 2017, there's been a sharp decline again in the population, where we've had about 142 right whales killed. And our goal is to educate people on why the whales are important and why it's important to save these large creatures that have been around for a very, very long time. So they're the third largest whale that we have. When people think about whales and they think orca, killer whales, and they think those are large, and we know that the blue whale is the largest, humpback is the second, and the North Atlantic right whale is the third largest, weighs over 50 tons, is larger than a school bus. And the whales are really important to our ecosystem for a lot of different reasons. So would you mind if I just explain that to you?
Yes, please.
Okay, so in terms of environmental, humanitarian, and economic reasons, the whales are extremely important. So the right whales, they feed deep in the ocean bed, and they feed on copepods, which are small krill and crustaceans. And when they swim up to the surface for air, they poop. And in that floats along the surface of the ocean. And in that contains both plankton, contains phytoplankton and zooplankton. Now, the phytoplankton then receives sunlight via the photosynthesis process. So there's a carbon sink and a release of oxygen into the atmosphere. So that's one major impact, because that oxygen is really great for us as a whole, as humans, and for the earth. And that's a large amount of oxygen that comes out of that, because the whales have, they're so large, they carry and they can store so much carbon within their bodies. So this whole photosynthesis process is extremely important. They also migrate up and down the northeast Atlantic coast. So they come all the way from the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada, and they migrate down to the warm waters of South Georgia and Amelia Island, which is where we are in Florida, so that they can give birth to their calves. So part of this migration process and part of the coming up from air and also relieving themselves, let's say, they're also migrating those nutrients along the coastline. And that's also feeding other marine life that eventually the fish are going to get some of those nutrients. That increases our fish population. So more right whales could potentially increase and help recover fishing areas in certain parts of the northeast coast. And it also means that that's good for the fishing industry. So it's good for the economy, because the fishermen need more fish. They need more fish to, repopulate the areas. And then it also helps us as humans, because we consume the fish. So that's healthier produce for us as well. So it's really important for all of those reasons why we continue to look to conserve this species.
Barb Zoodsma, this species is under stress for a variety of reasons, but one of them is boat strikes, and there's been an effort to implement some speed reductions on boats. What is the status of that right now, and why is that so controversial?
Where do you start with that one, right?
Yeah.
Boat strikes, vessel strikes are a huge problem for right whales. It's one of the leading causes of their mortality. The other is entanglement in fishing gear. You were asking about boat strikes. Excuse me. And yes, NOAA proposed some new rules basically to amend the existing speed rule that's in place. Why that is so controversial, I'm probably not a good one to ask about that, because for me, it's very straightforward that it needs to happen.
Well, let me make the argument. I mean, certainly there's a lot of charter fishermen that say if they were, to use these speeds to get out to the fishing areas that they take their clients to, they simply couldn't do a day trip, for instance, at that speed, that it would not be
Okay.
feasible.
Yeah. So good argument, right? But I would also say that when this rule is in place, it would be in place in the winter. I've been out on the water in the winter, and it's pretty dang cold.
Yeah.
And there aren't a lot of other boats that I've seen out there. So, not to say there aren't boats out there, because there are, especially down around Canaveral, Jacksonville Beach, and south. There can be some boats offshore during the winter. But these regulations are in place in the winter, and that's not when the main push is for going out fishing.
Yeah. Greg Reilly, what is your level of confidence in the survivability of this species, given how few of this species remain?
Well, there's no doubt that we can reduce mortality. The two main threats, as has been stated, are entanglement in fishing gear and vessel strikes, and there are answers to both of those threats. For entanglements, the main issue is that trap and lobster pot fisheries have lines that attach to a buoy at the surface, and the whales become entangled in them. We can replace that old technology with new technology during whale season for those fisheries. There are on-demand fishing gear sets. It's essentially the first trap in a line of traps, has a buoy in it that can be remotely triggered to release, bringing a buoy to the surface so the fisher can retrieve that gear without there being line in the water while whales are there. That's one solution that is being worked on. There are fishers that are fishing with that gear in closed areas these days, but there's not enough of it. There's not enough adoption yet. For vessel strikes is a little tougher, but we do know that slower vessel speeds overall reduce mortality significantly. Unfortunately, right now, that is the only tool in our toolbox to prevent strikes. There is some encouraging activity that's happening, specifically with industry engagement and technology provider engagement. NOAA has, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has announced a grant, Vessel Strike Avoidance Fund, $6 million to pursue technological solutions. One of the ones that's being implemented now, and in Jacksonville, in fact, is using AIS, which stands for Automatic Identification System. It's a safety system that all vessels 65 feet and above are required to carry, and many vessels below that threshold carry it voluntarily. We are collaborating with a tech provider called Maritime Information Systems out of Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Greg, I'm just gonna cut you off because I am running up against the clock here. And Barb, you just briefly wanted to address that.
Yeah,
certainly.
A couple of things. I just wanted to follow up on your question. Where is the speed rule amendment? We're in the middle of an election season, so that's likely not going to come up until after the election is resolved, right? Nobody wants to create waves. As far as seafood, in the Southeast here, we are very good at protecting whales. Buy local seafood.
All right. The Right Whale Festival is coming up this weekend. Barb Zoodsma, Greg Reilly, M. Devonish, thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Up next, haunting sights in the Halloween night sky.
Elder Source's T-Care program can help caregivers avoid burnout. Caregivers that assist Northeast Florida residents aged 60 or older may be eligible to get resources for themselves at no cost. More information at myeldersource.org. Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com.
Who do you want as a keynote speaker at Teach?
I would like to hear from Vincent Taylor.
I plan to use Vincent Taylor songs in my classroom. Vincent Taylor, he was amazing.
I love Vincent Taylor's passion for education, and I want to hear more.
Join us at Teach for Vincent Taylor's keynote on Saturday, November 23rd. For more info, visit wjct.org/teach.
False claims about the 2024 election are expected to get worse after Election Day.
To claim that they could not have seen it coming if there is post-election violence is absolutely irresponsible. We can all see it coming.
How social media companies are preparing for a deluge of misinformation after votes are cast. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11, here on WJCT News 89.9.
Breast cancer treatment isn't what it was. In the 1970s, disfiguring surgeries called radical mastectomies were common. Now, less invasive procedures and radiation dominate. Why? Step forward, Bernie Fisher. Next time on 1A, we explore the new podcast, Less Radical, about the man who revolutionized breast cancer treatment.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, if you're looking for a good scare this Halloween, you might just need to look up. Here to explain the science behind sinister images in the night sky is Eddie Whistler, director of the planetarium at the Museum of Science and History. Hey, Eddie.
Hello. It's always so much fun.
It is so nice to have you here. Are you a fan of Halloween?
I am. I do love it.
Yeah.
It always sneaks up on me. And
Yeah.
I have kids, so it's especially fun, you know?
Are you all set though? Costumes, candy?
I'm never set.
Okay.
Come on, give me a break.
All right.
But it's tomorrow. I got all kinds of time.
There are some very Halloween themed things happening in the sky above us.
Yes.
Or the atmosphere, I should say.
Yeah, well, there's a lot that we can say. You could say look up, but you're actually not going to see what it is that we're going to talk about. You need to look down at your computer screen
Or through a telescope.
or through a telescope.
Okay, well, start by telling us about something called the Witch Head Nebula, because that's just
It's
delightful.
perfect. Yeah, and if you look up one thing today while you're at work and you're just, able to have just a couple minutes of fun, then the Witch Head Nebula is what you want to look up. And you saw it. Doesn't it look exactly like what is advertised?
100%. It's a profile of a witch.
It's the profile
Clearly.
of a witch, definitely. And so it's a nebula out there in space that is. So we have to set the scene. If you're at the surface of the Earth, in every square centimeter, we have something like 15 quintillion particles of matter packed away in every square. What is a square centimeter? I don't know. A sugar cube.
A sugar cube.
International Space Station. You go up a couple 100 miles. It's orbiting up there. Now it has something like 5 million particles per cubic centimeter. That's a lot less.
Yeah.
15 quintillion, that's 19 zeros. Okay? A few million, that's 50 million is 7 zeros. And then you get out to places where these nebulae are, and you could have 1 to 1,000 particles per cubic centimeter. And so we're talking about very diffuse and ghostly.
Haunting.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that is ghostly by any standard, these kinds of particles that are so diffuse out there in space. But the thing is when we look at them through telescopes, we're taking many light years, hundreds, maybe even thousands of light years across, and you're able to see that in, through the lens of a telescope, and you're just putting it an inch across. So you're confining a whole lot of stuff that might be diffuse, but it's concentrated in the way that you're looking at it. And so you're able to see these nebulae.
What is a nebulae?
So a nebulae is the plural of a nebula. And a nebula is it's a catch-all term. There's a lot of ways to be a nebula, but it's just a dust and gas cloud in space.
That's sort of a nebulous answer.
Don't you love it? I love where you go with these things.
What about the Skull Nebula? What is that action?
Oh, so I'm unfamiliar with the Skull Nebula off the top of my head. I'm sure I've seen it.
All right.
But it's going to be the same thing, right? So we're talking about very diffuse particles. These could be like gaseous particles, like hydrogen, but they can also be actual particles, like what we think of as like dusty things. But you have to think really small, typically. So we're talking about particle sizes that are like campfire smoke, individual particle, separated out in space.
Very diffuse.
Very diffuse.
So these are, sort of scary themed, Halloween themed sightings. But what else are you watching for right now in the sky?
So there's constellations that are up. One thing that I really love to see at this time of year is the Great Square. So if you look kind of overhead,
It sounds sort of boring.
kind of boring. Oh yeah. So if we're looking for scary,
No, I want to hear about the square. I'm just saying the Great Square. It doesn't really.
it doesn't sing to us about the scary and the threat and the horror, does it? But it connects us to our ancient ancestors who were celebrating these kinds of things way back, because we're all human, and so these geometric patterns pop out to all of the different cultures around the world. Not everybody connected the dots in the same way in the nighttime sky, but things that pop out to humans seem to have really been identified as something special by cultures the globe around.
Kind of consistently.
Consistently, exactly.
Huh.
Stuff like the Big Dipper was called many different things, the Great Square, so on and so forth.
I'm going to look up the Great Square. I had not heard of that, Eddie.
Yeah, it is the body of the horse Pegasus in the bigger constellation that it's a part of.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, Eddie Whistler, we love having you here. Thanks for giving us the little spook-tastic look at the night sky.
Yeah, no doubt.
All
Take
right.
a look. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being here. That's our program. Thank you for listening. If you have any comments or feedback, you can send it to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. Join us tomorrow for the Halloween edition of First Coast Connect, when we ask relationship therapists about causes and emotional impacts of ghosting. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on
Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Voting is underway, not just for president, but on Florida amendments, local candidates, and more. Understand the issues with Jacksonville Today's unbiased voter guides at jaxtoday.org/vote.